Hello, and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we explore a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is September 3rd. On this day in 2004, in the town of Beslan in southern Russia, the world witnessed the end of one of the most horrifying hostage crises in modern history. For 53 hours, more than 1,000 children, parents, and teachers were trapped inside of a school gym rigged with explosives. When the siege ended, it wasn't in relief or triumph. Instead, it ended in chaos, explosions, and gunfire. Today, we're talking about the Beslan siege, a tragic event in which more than 330 people were killed, 186 of whom were children. Let's get started. September 1st in Russia is known as Knowledge Day. It's a joyful tradition. Children wear their best clothes, parents bring flowers, and schools open their doors with music and ceremonies. In Beslan, North Ossetia, that morning was no different. At school number 1, more than 800 children gathered with their families and teachers. But just after 9 a.m., a truck and van rolled up to the gates. At first, people thought that it might be a drill. The men were in camouflage and some were dressed as workers. Then, they opened fire into the air. Panic swept through the courtyard. Some people managed to run. About 50 escaped, some hiding in the boiler room. But more than 1,100 people were herded into the gym. That gym had been built only weeks earlier. Instead of sports, it became a prison wired with bombs. Tripwires crisscrossed the room and plastic bottles filled with explosives dangled from basketball hoops. Anyone who stumbled could have killed everyone inside. Witnesses remembered the militants shouting orders and shooting anyone who resisted. A man who spoke to others in Ossetian, a local language, was executed in front of the crowd. A father who refused to kneel was shot. Within hours, the walls of the gym were soaked in fear. Outside, police, soldiers, and special forces swarmed the school. Parents gathered behind barricades, screaming for their children. And yet, officials released very little information. They even downplayed the numbers. First saying it was 200 hostages, then 400, when in truth, it was over 1,000. As the siege stretched into its second day, conditions in the gym became unbearable. There was no food, no clean water, and the temperatures were soaring. Parents ripped the leaves off of plants to feed their children. Some hostages drank urine to survive. Mothers tried to shield their children from the bombs hanging above their heads. One survivor, Nadezhda Gurieva, remembered carrying her wounded child across the blood-stained floor, stepping around explosives as she tried to find a safe corner. There were other horrors as well, reports of executions and sexual assaults. And everywhere, there was the constant threat of a misstep triggering an explosion. Meanwhile, outside, the families were frantic. They begged authorities for information, for negotiation, for help. Pediatrician Leonid Rashal, who had mediated in past hostage crises, offered to trade himself for the children, or at least bring in water and medicine. The militants refused. Their demand was political. They wanted Russian forces to be withdrawn from Chechnya. As night fell on September 2nd, the gym was dark, hot, and suffocating. Children fainted, parents prayed, and everyone waited, not knowing if they would live to see the morning. On September 3rd, the fragile stalemate collapsed. At 12:50 p.m., medical workers were briefly allowed to collect bodies from outside. For a moment, there was a strange calm. Then, militants opened fire on the rescue teams. At 1:05 p.m., 2 bombs inside the gym detonated. Some were killed instantly. Others ran blindly for the doors. At 1:10 p.m., Russian special forces stormed the building. Gunfire erupted and flames spread through the gym. The roof collapsed, sending a cloud of dust and sparks over the hostages who were still trapped inside. At 1:40 p.m., amid the smoke and bullets, some children broke free, running barefoot and half-dressed through the schoolyard. Soldiers carried others, bloodied and burned, out of the wreckage. Then, at 2:30 p.m., about a dozen militants barricaded themselves in a nearby house. Tanks and flamethrowers were deployed. By evening, the siege was over. Every hostage taker was either dead or in custody. The hostage takers may have been dead, but so were 334 hostages, 186 of whom were children. Among the dead were babies, teachers, and grandparents who had only come to celebrate the first day of school. 11 members of the Russian security forces were also killed. A British reporter who arrived at the hospital described children lying on stretchers in their underwear, covered in soot and blood. Parents ran from ward to ward, searching for their sons and daughters, and many never found them alive. For survivors, the end of the siege was not an ending at all. It was the beginning of a lifetime of grief. 17-year-old Agunda Vatayeva escaped with her mother. Decades later, she still says, quote, "It feels like it's only been 5 years, not 20. End quote. Time, for her and many others, has not softened the pain. The mothers of Beslan have carried that grief into activism. Women like Marina Pak, who lost her 13-year-old daughter Svetlana, into memorials so places are full of flowers and colors forever. But they also demand answers. Why were tanks and flamethrowers used with children still inside? In 2017, the European Court of Human Rights ruled that Russian forces failed to prevent the attack despite intelligence warnings, and that their use of indiscriminate heavy weapons caused unnecessary deaths. Families were awarded compensation, but for many, it was no victory. One mother said, quote, "We wanted truth, not money," end quote. The Beslan siege reshaped Russia. Politically, it gave the government justification to centralize power and tighten control. Socially, it scarred a generation. Children who lived through 3 days of terror grew up with trauma that has never faded. But above all, it left families fractured. Some survivors still suffer from survivor's guilt. Others, like the activist groups Mothers of Beslan and Voice of Beslan, continue to fight for an independent investigation. They faced pressure, harassment, even disbandment orders, but they refuse to be silenced. At the 20th anniversary, Russian President Vladimir Putin finally visited the site. For many parents, it was too little too late. They stood under the portraits of their children, holding candles, still waiting for the answers that they had been denied. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If you found today's story compelling, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. It'll help us grow. And be sure to join me again tomorrow as we explore another significant event in true crime history. Until then, stay safe and remember that behind every headline is a life worth remembering. Day by Day True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!